given the weather conditions and classes being canceled, I wanted to produce this lecture so that we don't fall behind on material. The purpose of this lecture is to finish up the material from Chapter 1, which is on criminology and the sociological perspective. We've already defined what the sociological perspective is and how it relates to the study of crime. So, how did society's views on the cause of crime develop to this point? So, in the 1400s and 1500s, crime was seen as being related to religion. For example, it was assumed that individuals engaged in crime because demons or witches consumed them, or that God created criminals to be an example for others to show what would happen if one didn't follow the rules. And then during the Enlightenment period, or the 1700s, society began moving away from religious explanations for crime. The Enlightenment period brought about the idea that God had left people to govern themselves, in the sense that God gave people free will to make their own choices. Criminal behavior was seen as being guided by people's rational choices of the weighing of risks and rewards of engaging in crime. And moving from the 1700s into the 1800s, the classical perspective evolved. And this saw crime as being due to people's rational choice to engage in crime. Although the classical perspective showed changes in the way that society felt crimes should be punished. Prior to this time, punishments were extreme, but with the classical perspective, scholars felt that punishments should be equivalent to the crime and no harsher than absolutely necessary. The classical perspective morphed into the positivist perspective, which is also known as the sociological perspective. So this is the prevailing view of crime today since the 1800s. The sociological or positivist perspective doesn't focus on crime as being a choice. Instead, this sees that the causes of crime can be individual and structural in nature. So this views the circumstances of an individual's life as being important for understanding why people engage in crime. And this perspective acknowledges that not everyone is, quote-unquote, dealt the same hand, so to say. So some people who were influential in the development of the sociological perspective will now be discussed. First, Durkheim. Also, please note that you don't necessarily need to memorize the dates for the exams. The dates are included on the slides to just give you an idea about the historical context of the information. Anyways, Durkheim saw crime as being normal and even inevitable in societies. So given the differences between people's lives, so their socialization, their experiences, their circumstances, Durkheim felt that it was natural that some people would end up engaging in crime. And his acknowledgement of differences helped to blossom the sociological perspective, since he stressed the differences between people based on their social status or class, and the division of labor in society. Similar to Durkheim's perspective, Du Bois felt that negative social conditions, such as poverty, segregation, homelessness, unemployment, victimization, oppression, etc., were important causes of crime. As with the sociological perspective in general, Du Bois disagreed with the biological explanations of crime. Du Bois felt that crime was, in part, caused by people's rebellion from the negative social conditions that they experienced. And finally, Sutherland also acknowledged that the way the social structure of society influenced crime rates. So Sutherland was important in early studies examining crime in the city of Chicago. And his research revealed that high crime rates were consistent in certain neighborhoods in inner city Chicago year after year, despite population turnover. And from his research, he concluded that the cause of crime was due to neighborhood characteristics and not the type of people that lived in any specific area. So these three men are examples of scholars who followed the positivist or sociological perspective on crime, since they all stressed the social conditions that influence crime. Moving forward with some important terms to know. The first is mala in se crimes. Mala in se literally means, quote unquote, evil in themselves. That is, behaviors that people would inherently view as evil and heinous are crimes that would be considered mala in se crimes. So these are crimes that are against the law and go against social norms. So they are criminal and deviant behaviors. One example of mala in se crimes are the crimes that Ted Bundy committed. Bundy is a famous serial killer who admitted to murdering upwards of 30 women in the 1970s. And a recent example of mala in se crimes are the crimes that Chris Watts committed. Watts recently pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison for killing his pregnant wife and their 2 children. On the other hand, mala prohibita crimes are behaviors that are only considered crimes because there is a law against the behavior. So mala prohibita crimes are not necessarily seen as being inherently wrong, such as speeding. Of course, the laws may be in place for safety reasons, but people generally wouldn't categorize speeders as being inherently evil people. So mala prohibita crimes are those that break the law but aren't necessarily deviant or out of the norm for citizens to engage in. Some other terms that were mentioned in this chapter were felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies are serious crimes that are punishable by incarceration for more than a year in prison. Some examples of felonies are homicide, rape, and robbery. And misdemeanors are less serious crimes that are at most punishable by a year in jail, and they're sometimes just punishable with fines. Some examples of misdemeanors are minor larceny or theft, possession of 2 ounces of marijuana, and prostitution. A key thing to also note is the difference here between the terms jail and prison. These terms are not interchangeable. Jails are facilities that generally hold people who are awaiting trial, so they haven't been convicted yet, or who are convicted of misdemeanors. Jails are also different from prisons because jails are operated by the local county. And then additionally, jails hold men and women. In contrast, prisons are facilities that only hold people who are convicted. Prisons are operated by the state or federal government, not the county. And additionally, prisons only hold one sex, so there are separate facilities for men and women. The last bit of information that will be important to know is how the study of criminology is scientific in nature. So the scientific study of crime involves the development of theories and hypotheses that are empirically tested. Generally, research examines how something, X, the independent variable, influences some other thing, Y, the dependent variable. For example, research could examine how having a criminal record influences employment. So the independent variable in this case, having a criminal record, does the influencing. The dependent variable, in this case employment, is influenced by the independent variable. Within criminology, researchers can use surveys, experiments, and qualitative methods to scientifically study crime. Surveys are essentially questionnaires that individuals answer, such as the one you took on the first day of class in this course. Surveys can be given to the general public, students, inmates, etc. They can measure, as it relates to crime, involvement in crime and delinquency, get opinions on crime and the criminal justice system, or to measure people's victimization experiences, for example. These survey result in quantitative data or numerical data that can be quantitatively analyzed. Experiments are less common in sociology and criminology. Experiments involve groups of people that are put into a quote-unquote treatment group and a control group. Both groups are supposed to experience very similar conditions, and the only thing that is supposed to differ between the groups is the variable of interest. So the purpose of this is to try and determine how the treatment of interest affects participants. If researchers wanted to know how being incarcerated affects mental health, it would be inhumane to assign some people to the quote-unquote treatment of incarceration. Thus, experimental studies aren't as common in criminology. However, I may cover a handful of well-known experimental studies later in the semester. And finally, qualitative methods involve interviews, ethnographies, and observations. So as opposed to the surveys described above, qualitative methods do not result in numerical analyses. Instead, qualitative research involves rich analysis of words or observations. For example, if you were asked, how many times did you engage in larceny theft as a teenager? That would be a survey question that resulted in a quantitative numerical answer. However, if you were asked, tell me about the first time you engaged in larceny theft. What were the circumstances? What did you steal? Were you with anyone? Those would be interview questions that resulted in a lengthy answer full of rich detail. So that would fall under qualitative research. Today, empirical research studies are published in peer-reviewed research articles, and these are published in prominent academic journals that go through a rigorous process before publication. So this concludes Chapter 1.